I walked into the certified public accountant's office just hoping to get an extension on my property taxes. The experienced accountant stared at his computer screen, and all the color drained from his face. "Mrs. Miller, you need to look at this balance," he said. He turned the monitor toward me, and right there on the screen was a liquid asset balance of $68 million. When I asked him where on earth that money came from, his answer completely shattered my reality. "Hey everyone, I am Sarah. I am so glad you could join me again late tonight. Please subscribe to my channel and give this video a like. Also, let me know in the comments what city you are listening from. That way I can see just how far my story has traveled. In the year since David passed away from a sudden heart attack, I have learned that grief follows a strict schedule. It hits right at 6 in the morning when the coffee maker starts bubbling, and there is no one left to complain that I brew it too strong. It strikes after school, when my 12-year-old son Leo still scans the pickup line for his dad's old Ford truck before reality snaps him back. It creeps in on the 1st of every month, too, when I sit at the dining table checking bills, feeling that very specific terror of keeping a family afloat on a single income. We still live in the old Victorian house we bought 7 years ago in Evanston, up on the north shore of Chicago. Out back, the wooden deck David always promised to fix but never had time for still creaks in the wind. I work as a freelance medical illustrator. It gives me the flexible hours I need to take care of Leo, who has dyslexia. But that income barely covers our living expenses and his pricey special education tutors, leaving absolutely zero left over. The payout from David's life insurance helped us pay off the mortgage, and I am grateful for that. But being grateful and being financially secure are two entirely different things, and I had gotten pretty used to that gap. Aside from this house and a 12-year-old boy who inherited his father's stubborn streak, the only thing I have left is my so-called family. Eleanor, David's mother, is the founder and chairwoman of Silver Leaf Senior Living. It is a massive medical real estate empire she built with the financial backing of her second husband. Arthur, David's younger half-brother, is the company's chief operating officer and general counsel. They have always been a fixture in our lives. At first, their presence felt like this strong family safety net. It was only later that I slowly realized it was much closer to a condescending form of surveillance. Right after David's funeral, Eleanor insisted on taking over all the complicated legal paperwork. The death certificate, the insurance claims, the tiny college fund David set up for Leo, and really anything with their family name attached. "You have enough on your plate, honey," she would say. She always used this tone that made you feel like turning her down would make you an ungrateful brat. So I gave in. I told myself she was just being kind. Looking back at it now with clear eyes, it was nothing but a desperate need for control disguised as kindness. But at the time I was so mentally exhausted that I just could not tell the difference. The very first unsettling clue popped up last November. It was an urgent piece of mail sent from Seattle, addressed to David, who had been gone for 6 months at that point. Arthur happened to drop by the house that afternoon to bring over a Thanksgiving gift. I was holding the envelope, wondering aloud what it could be. Before I could even finish my sentence, Arthur just smoothly slipped it right out of my hand. "Probably just more of those relentless alumni donation letters from David's college days," he said casually, sliding it straight into his briefcase. "I will handle it." I thought it was a little strange how eager he was to help his widowed sister-in-law sort out junk mail, but I just let it go, exactly like I had compromised on countless other little things that whole year. Then came the comment I could never quite scrub from my mind. We were at a Sunday family dinner in Eleanor's luxurious Gold Coast mansion. She was 2 glasses deep into her Chardonnay. Alcohol always seemed to loosen her polite mask and reveal exactly what she thought of me. She held her glass, looking at me right over the rim, and said, "You know, Leo is so incredibly lucky to have family like us. If it was just you trying to raise him by drawing pictures of bones and organs, I shudder to think how that boy would turn out." She smiled while she said it, using that specific smile people use when they are trying to dress up a knife as a compliment. Sitting across from her, Arthur let out a soft chuckle. I did not laugh at all. After that, I started picking up on other things, tiny separate details that were so easy to brush off. Once on the phone, Arthur slipped up and mentioned a trust approval before quickly correcting himself and calling it a college fund statement. Whenever I gently asked if David's biological father had left anything behind, Eleanor was always evasive. David had once told me, practically word for word, that his real dad, Richard Sterling, was a deadbeat loser who died in a motorcycle crash in the 80s. He supposedly left nothing behind and wanted absolutely zero to do with his wife or son. For 14 years of marriage, I never had a single reason to doubt that story. That was until I started noticing how carefully, almost as if she were walking on eggshells, Eleanor would steer every single conversation away from that exact topic. By April of this year, my savings were tapped out. I had to pay for Leo's summer reading boot camp, and I was staring down a massive upcoming hike in Illinois property taxes. I could have asked Eleanor for a loan, but something deep down in my gut strongly resisted falling back into that reflex of depending on her. So I drove down to a local tax consulting firm. I sat down with a senior certified public accountant named Benjamin Hayes, hoping to use the equity in my house to get a bridge loan. Benjamin typed my social security number and David's estate tax identification number into his computer system, his fingers tapping away at the keyboard. Suddenly, he stopped. The look on his face shifted. It was a look I had never seen on any financial professional before. His polite, businesslike mask completely shattered, replaced by a deadly serious, almost terrified expression. "Mrs. Miller," he said, choosing his words very carefully, "I think you need to look at this yourself." He pushed the monitor so it faced me. Right there on an internal system tax record, hooked to a trust account where David was listed as the sole beneficiary, it laid out years of rolled-over commercial real estate dividends and tech patent royalties. The current liquid asset balance was exactly $68,412,026.33. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. I was absolutely sure it was some ridiculous system glitch. Somebody put a decimal point in the wrong place, or somehow crossed my account with a multinational corporate executive's file. "There is no way this is real," I said. Benjamin was not laughing. His hands were shaking just a little bit as he picked up his desk phone, getting ready to contact the Internal Revenue Service Verification Department. When I asked him, half joking but half terrified, where an astronomical sum of money like that could possibly come from, he looked at me with something close to pity. Then he told me the only honest thing he could say. "I have no idea where it came from, Mrs. Miller. But these tax codes and asset vouchers, they are entirely real." I did not sleep a wink that night. I laid there on the empty side of our queen bed, my brain frantically crunching the same household budget numbers I always calculated when I had insomnia. Only this time, the math felt completely pointless. $68 million does not just magically appear in the tax profile of a part-time medical illustrator. Wealth on that scale has a source. That source has an owner. And sooner or later, that owner was going to come knocking on my door to take back what belonged to them. My first reaction was not lottery-winning excitement. It was pure fear. It was the specific kind of dread that belongs to a woman who has followed the rules her entire adult life. I even pictured the news headlines in my head. "Widow embezzles, massive bank error, faces major fraud charges." I could easily picture losing the house. I could see Leo being taken away by a heartless child protective system. That system would not care how the mistake happened, only that the money was sitting in my name. Right before he closed up the office, Benjamin privately told me that he did some standard due diligence checking. He found out the funds were tied to an entity called the Sterling Technology and Vision Trust, run by a trust management agency out in Seattle. That was all he knew. He warned me not to touch a single dime until lawyers and auditors could verify exactly where the money came from and that it was legal. I swore to him I would not touch it. I meant every word. I had zero desire to spend a massive fortune I could not even begin to explain. The last name Sterling did not actually hit me until I was halfway home. I was gripping the steering wheel at a red light when it smacked me across the face like a heavy slap. Sterling, Richard Sterling, David's biological dad. The deadbeat man Eleanor claimed abandoned his family and died in a car wreck. The guy who left absolutely nothing behind except a last name David rarely used and hated bringing up. For 14 years of marriage, I bought that version of the story completely, because I simply had no reason not to. But I had a reason now. I did not call Eleanor. My usual instinct, the one where I automatically asked her for help whenever I ran into red tape, was completely gone. Losing that reflex was all the proof I needed to realize just how drastically my world had flipped upside down in the last 24 hours. That night, after Leo fell asleep, I grabbed a flashlight. I went down into the converted half-basement. It was David's prized architectural studio. Since he passed away, I never had the courage to touch anything in there. But tonight, it was not sentimentality driving me. It was pure desperation. I needed to find anything with the name Sterling printed on it. I spent almost 3 hours searching through the dusty room and piles of blueprint tubes. Finally, at the very bottom of a storage cabinet, I found it. It was a heavy metal drafting tube. A label in David's handwriting read, "Chicago Riverwalk Blueprints, 1998. But when I popped the cap off, blueprints did not slide out. Instead, out fell an old flash drive, some yellowed copies of bank statements, and a notarized letter. The letter was from the law firm Howard & Duncan out in Seattle. It was dated the year David turned 21. The contents clearly mentioned an irrevocable trust set up by Richard Sterling for his son, complete with contact names and addresses. There was also a Polaroid picture inside the tube that I had never seen before. It showed David at about 10 years old. He was working on a vintage car engine with a man in a messy garage. Both of their faces were smeared with motor oil, but they were smiling from ear to ear. On the back of the photo, written in 2 different handwriting styles, it said, "Dad and Little Davy, Seattle, summer 1996. David knew. He had always known the trust existed. He knew his biological dad was absolutely not the deadbeat loser Eleanor made him out to be. But he chose to hide all of this in a blueprint tube. He did that rather than face the massive storm that would have destroyed his mother's controlling household if the truth ever came out. I sat on the cold basement floor holding that photo for a long time. I mourned my husband in an entirely new and complicated way. I did not just miss him. I suddenly realized the heavy emotional burden he had been carrying all on his own all those years. At the same time, a sickening feeling started churning in my stomach. Did Eleanor know that David actually knew everything? When I finally went back up to the bedroom to get some rest, the fear was still there. But something else was starting to take root in the wreckage of that fear. If this money was real, and Benjamin's reaction proved it absolutely was, then someone had been managing it. Or more accurately, someone had been secretly embezzling my late husband's massive inheritance for nearly 30 years. And under every law I could think of, that inheritance now belonged entirely to Leo. That meant someone had been treating a 12-year-old boy's legal birthright like a dirty little secret. I still did not know who this person was. I did not know how they did it. I had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole went. But one thing was crystal clear. I needed someone completely disconnected from this family to help me uncover the truth. I needed an outsider with zero interest in protecting Eleanor's so-called family honor. The next morning, I emailed my clients to push back my deadlines. I sat at the dining table, letting my coffee go completely cold. I searched online for Chicago estate litigation and trust dispute lawyers. I kept looking until I crossed out every single law firm that had ever sponsored one of Eleanor's charity galas. Finally, I landed on an attorney named Marcus Vance. His website had no fancy marketing jargon. It just had one very blunt sentence. It said, "We only represent victimized beneficiaries, never greedy institutions." My hands were shaking a little when I dialed the number. It was the first decision I had made entirely on my own in 8 months. Marcus's office was on the 6th floor of a renovated warehouse building in downtown Chicago. For some reason, the exposed brick walls and the slightly worn second-hand wooden desk made me trust him way more than any marble-lined corporate lobby ever could. He was in his early 50s and a former federal financial crimes prosecutor. He had this unhurried but intensely sharp calmness about him. He let me talk for a solid half hour. He did not interrupt me a single time, only nodding for me to keep going. When I finished telling him about the accountant's discovery, the letter from Seattle, David's hidden drafting tube, and Eleanor's decades of insisting she would handle everything, Marcus finally put down his fountain pen. "Mrs. Miller," he said, folding his hands on the desk, If even half of what you just told me is accurate, your husband was very likely the sole beneficiary of a massive, irrevocable trust. And someone has been secretly manipulating this trust for 30 years without his full knowledge or consent. Since David passed away before the trust's termination date and never changed the designated beneficiary, this enormous asset has legally and automatically transferred to his direct descendant, which means your son. He paused for a second, his eyes turning razor sharp. My first priority right now, as your legal counsel, is to issue a legally binding document preservation demand straight to that trust agency in Seattle. We need to freeze the actual financial records on file before anyone gets the chance to rewrite history or destroy the evidence. Getting the documents took 2 weeks. During that time, I did my best to act like everything was perfectly normal. I kept drawing my medical illustrations. I kept making Leo's lunches. And I did not say a single word about any of this to Eleanor or Arthur. Looking back, that silence was a silent declaration of war all on its own. Eleanor was highly sensitive, and she definitely sensed that something was off. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice had that fake casual tone she always used when she was fishing for information. "You have been so quiet lately," she said. "Are you and Leo doing all right? You are not running into any trouble, are you?" I told her we were fine. I made up an excuse that I was just busy enrolling Leo in a new special education center and had a mountain of paperwork to fill out every day. The pause on the other end of the line lasted just a half-second longer than a normal conversation. "If you were keeping anything from me, you would definitely tell me, right?" she asked. "After all, we are family. There is nothing we cannot solve internally." "Of course," I told her. As I said it, I felt a flash of self-disgust at how easily that lie rolled right off my tongue. But at the same time, I despised her even more. She was the one forcing me to wear this mask. I did not know it at the time, but Eleanor and Arthur were already sitting on pins and needles. I found out later that Arthur had just received a routine compliance inquiry from the trust management agency in Seattle right around this time. It was a standard notice sent to anyone listed as a discretionary co-trustee. The letter informed him that, following the confirmation of David Miller's death and the verification of his son as the sole legal heir, the trust assets had entered the legal transfer process. It also stated that an internal review had been triggered due to a formal letter of representation from a lawyer. To an ordinary person, it was just a form letter. There were 0 accusations anywhere in the text. But to Arthur, it was basically a death warrant. He was the general counsel who had spent the last 15 years quietly siphoning off massive trust management fees through complex legal loopholes without ever breathing a word of it to David or me. The files arrived at Marcus's office on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks later. He told me to get down there immediately. The conference table was completely covered in trust statements and tax records spanning 3 whole decades. Once you knew exactly what you were looking for, the sheer evil hiding behind those numbers was shocking. Richard Sterling did not die in a car crash in the late 80s. He died of pancreatic cancer. Right before he passed away, he took the early shares he got from a Seattle tech company, along with the rights to several patents, and put them all into an irrevocable trust. The initial funding was roughly $5 million. The trust was specifically set up to let the money grow tax-free with compound interest until David turned 35, at which point it would all be handed over to him. Or, in the tragic event of David dying young, it would pass directly down to his children. The real problem was the trustee list. Eleanor, as David's biological mother, was listed as a co-trustee with limited discretionary power. For 28 solid years, she expertly abused that power. She constantly authorized huge trustee compensation payouts and administrative reimbursements straight into her own pockets. Later on, she dragged Arthur into the mix, listing him as legal counsel and joint manager. According to the preliminary math done by Marcus's team, those two had fabricated all sorts of excuses to drain over $1.2 million right out of the trust's principal. Every single cent of that money was supposed to belong exclusively to David. But as bad as the stolen money was, those documents proved something even more chilling. Eleanor knew about this trust from the very beginning. She had signed countless legal papers confirming the status of the trust. On one hand, she fed David, and later me, a completely fabricated story about a heartless, penniless biological dad. On the other hand, she was secretly leeching off the inheritance left behind by the very man she constantly cursed out. The market helped them cover up the whole thing. 30 years of a booming stock market and insanely profitable patent licensing turned that $5 million into $68 million. This massive fortune was basically invisible to the people who actually had the right to own it. Meanwhile, the exact person legally trusted to protect it spent a quarter of a century pretending it did not even exist. I sat there in Marcus's office holding a copy of a statement. It had Eleanor's actual signature right on it, and it was dated the exact same year David and I got married. In that moment, a heavy weight that had been hanging over me ever since David's funeral finally dropped to the floor. It was not just pure anger. The anger actually exploded later. Right then, it was a moment of total clarity. There was no room left for me to lie to myself and say it was just a misunderstanding. There was zero chance of letting Eleanor smooth things over with a few pretty words at some Sunday dinner. I had proof. And I was slowly realizing that proof was the only language this arrogant family understood. The following Monday, Marcus officially filed a petition in the Cook County Probate Court. We asked the court to formally recognize Leo as the sole successor beneficiary of the Sterling Trust. We also requested that I be appointed as his legal guardian and the sole trustee of the funds. On top of that, we demanded the highest level of judicial audit for every single expense Eleanor and Arthur had authorized over the past 28 years. On paper, it was just a quiet, carefully worded legal document, but in reality it was like firing a flare gun right over the heads of the entire Miller family. Before filing it, Marcus gave me a serious warning. He told me that taking this step would completely change the temperature of the situation. Once Eleanor received that court summons, she would not be able to pretend this was just relatives doing a little paperwork. Once the case is filed, it becomes an open legal battle, he said. He told me there was no withdrawing the lawsuit just to keep the peace. He asked if I was ready to face that kind of storm. I told him I was ready. But deep down I still had a little bit of anxiety until the moment that storm actually hit. Eleanor was served with the summons on a Wednesday morning. Within a single hour, she called me 7 times. I followed Marcus's advice and let every single call go straight to voicemail. Clearly, ignoring her was way more damaging than any shouting match. By 6 o'clock that evening, Eleanor and Arthur were standing right on my front porch. Both of them were wearing perfectly tailored coats. They had obviously left some high-end business dinner early just to rush over. "I cannot believe you stabbed us in the back." That was the very first thing Eleanor hurled at my face the second I opened the door. She did not even bother saying hello. The muscles in her face were tight. It is that specific look people get when fear completely takes over their anger, even though she was trying extremely hard to act furious. "Do you have any idea how stupid this is?" she yelled. "You dragged a completely private internal family matter into a filthy courtroom. You made us look like a bunch of con artists in front of all those outsiders." I kept my voice as steady as possible, exactly like I had promised myself I would. I looked at her and said, "You two are the ones who hid a trust that belonged to David for 30 years. I am not the one who turned a secret into a crime." Arthur stepped forward right then. His tone was much sharper than his mother's. It cut like a perfectly sharpened scalpel. "You really do not know what you are risking right now, Sarah," he said. "Leo's entire relationship with this family, with his grandmother and with his cousins, all depends on how this plays out. The courtroom is an incredibly unpredictable place. Once we get to the discovery phase, people can say absolutely anything. For example, they might question if a widow is mentally stable after her husband's death. They might ask if her judgment is impaired. They might even wonder if a freelancer's unpredictable income can really provide the best environment for a child with dyslexia." He left that last sentence hanging in the air on purpose. My stomach instantly turned to ice. I understood exactly what he was doing. It was a threat to take away my custody of Leo, all wrapped up in fake concern. "Are you threatening to take away my custody of my own son?" I asked him coldly. "We are just saying that family members do not need lawyers getting involved," Eleanor chimed in. Her tone suddenly softened. She was expertly switching up her strategy. "Withdraw that ridiculous lawsuit. Let us just reconcile the accounts privately, exactly like we have always done. There is absolutely no need for this to get so ugly. The 3 of us can sit down and resolve this like mature adults." A flash of that Polaroid picture crossed my mind. the one of David sitting on his biological dad's modified car. It was a memory he had to hide in a dark basement just to keep it safe. Then my mind flashed to that $50,000 consulting fee statement she signed the exact same year I got married. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You guys handled things privately for 28 years, and that is exactly the problem. The lawsuit is not getting withdrawn." The edges of Eleanor's perfect disguise finally cracked. "You are going to regret your arrogance today," she said through gritted teeth. There was zero acting left in her voice. Then she turned around and walked toward their black Porsche. Arthur followed half a step behind her. Right before he got in the car, he looked back and shot me a glance I could not completely read. It was not just pure hatred. It was much closer to a cold, calculating stare. He looked exactly like a Wall Street acquisitions expert figuring out how to completely destroy a rival company. I shut the door and stood in the hallway for a long time. My hands were shaking a little as I listened to their car engine roar away. Before I even sat down on the couch, I was dialing Marcus. My voice was fast and brief. While the memory was still fresh, I repeated Arthur's custody threat word for word. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then, in that reassuring, deep voice of his, he told me to write down exactly what happened right that second. He told me to add timestamps and email it to him that very night. Legally speaking, an isolated verbal threat like that is tough to use as direct evidence, Marcus explained. But if they actually dare to file a custody battle later on, this premeditated pattern of intimidation happening right when the trust lawsuit was filed will become your absolute best weapon in front of a judge. From this moment on, record every single word they say and everything they do. It was a bizarre kind of comfort. I was basically being told to gear up for a war I never even started. But that advice grounded me way more than any empty words of comfort ever could. Leo poked his head out from upstairs and asked if Grandma had already left. I told him she was gone and that everything was fine. In that exact second, I felt a very specific kind of exhaustion wash over me. In a single breath, I had spoken a freezing cold truth and spun a warm, comforting lie. I slept terribly that week. By Friday, I decided Leo and I needed to get far away from that house, even if it was just for a few days. At that point, every single time the doorbell rang, my stomach would tie itself in knots. My best friend Maya has a small cabin right on Lake Michigan. I did not overthink it. I just packed bags for both of us. We spent 3 lazy days up there doing absolutely nothing. The fish we caught were pathetically small. We constantly burned our marshmallows, and we slept in late every single morning. Maya is a pediatric emergency room nurse. She is completely used to life, death, and absolute chaos. She did not grill me for details like I expected. Every morning she just quietly handed me a second cup of black coffee and let me vent at my own pace. As a result, I ended up talking more in those 3 days than I had in the entire previous month combined. At one point, Leo was laying in a hammock and casually asked me why Grandma and Uncle Arthur seemed to be mad at me. I gave him the most stripped-down, honest answer I could think of. I told him that some money that was supposed to belong to him had gotten mixed up, and Mom was working hard to make sure he got back what was really his. He nodded, just like any innocent kid would. He thought the explanation made perfect sense, and then he went right back to skipping stones on the lake. For the rest of the trip, I was incredibly jealous of his childhood simplicity. Driving home, I watched his sleeping face resting against the car window. All I wanted was for that simplicity to stick with him just a little bit longer. 4 days after we got back from the lake, Arthur called. His voice was so warm I almost did not recognize it. "I have been thinking a lot these past few days, Sarah," he said. "I really think the way we communicated initially was flawed. How about we put a fair proposal on the table, a solution that stays strictly inside the family? No courts needed. $4 million. We can wire it straight into your account today. The only condition is that you drop the lawsuit. Leo still gets to enjoy the warmth of this big family. You get cold hard cash in your hand immediately, instead of waiting for a court ruling that could drag on for years with no guarantees. That way we can all just move forward." I let the silence hang on the phone. I stayed quiet for so long that he actually upped the offer himself. "If it makes you feel any better, make it $5 million. When I still did not answer, he completely switched up his tone. He got softer, almost begging. David would never want to see things turn out like this, Sarah. You know how much he hated conflict when he was alive. He would definitely want us to solve this quietly like a family, rather than dragging his name and some supposed scandal into a courtroom. Hearing him use David's kindness as an excuse to stop me from finding the truth felt unbelievably ironic. The older brother he was using as a shield had spent 14 years hiding letters from their biological dad in a basement, all just to protect Arthur from their mother's rage. I told him straight up, "You have no idea what David wanted, Arthur, because you did not even know he kept his father's belongings." The other end of the line fell into this long, suffocating pause. It lasted so long I almost thought he had hung up the phone. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was incredibly low. "You have absolutely no idea what you are messing with." After saying that, he did not wait for my response and just hung up the phone. I sat on the couch for a long time after that. I was holding my phone, which felt hot in my hand. I tried to figure out if his last sentence was a vicious threat or some kind of twisted, well-meaning warning from whatever shred of conscience he had left. I never did come to a conclusion. Listening to that bribe number keep climbing without me even saying a word felt exactly like watching a guy desperately bidding against himself at an auction. A year ago, $5 million would have sounded like a magic spell that could end all my anxiety. But now, it just showed its ugliest true colors. It was a deal trying to buy out 28 years of silence at a cheap discount. And the catch was that I could never again ask why that silence existed in the first place. I have zero interest in settling privately. That was the last thing I told him on the phone. The only thing I am interested in is the judicial audit report Marcus asked for. If you guys have nothing to hide, the audit will naturally clear your names. And this conversation we are having today is completely pointless. Over the next few weeks, I noticed that the direct pressure basically stopped. No more ambushes at my front door. No more late-night probing phone calls. Marcus told me this was a classic psychological tactic. People who get caught with their hand in the cookie jar usually switch from frantic attacks to quiet surveillance, he explained. They wait for you to show even the tiniest crack of exhaustion or weakness. Then they launch a fatal strike from a completely different angle. That quiet should have made me even more nervous. And it did, right up until one afternoon when I went to pick Leo up from school. I saw Arthur's silver Porsche parked half a block away from the school gate. The engine was running. He had absolutely no legitimate reason to be there. He did not get closer. He did not roll down his window. He just sat behind the tinted glass watching us cross the parking lot and get into my car like a cold-blooded snake. I did not say a word about it to Leo. That night, I told Marcus what happened. He just said one calm sentence. "Write it down and do not engage with them in any way." That became my survival mantra during that long waiting period. A week later, I was chatting with a neighbor by the mailboxes. She casually mentioned that an elegant woman who perfectly matched Eleanor's description had stopped her. The woman had very casually asked how Leo and I were doing lately. She asked if we had any weird visitors at the house, and if I had mentioned anything about wanting to sell the house and move away. I added that to the case file Marcus was building too, even though by themselves these actions sounded almost harmless. But during that time, what really kept me going was not that passive quiet. It was the fact that I did not have to carry all of this alone anymore. Over coffee one Saturday, I laid out the entire truth to Maya without holding anything back. I expected her to scream in shock. Instead, she just put down her cup, looked me right in the eye and said, "Okay, tell me what you need right now." She did not doubt me for a second. She just used it as the starting line to fight back. It just so happened that Maya's sister, Chloe Chen, was a digital forensics auditor at a top-tier accounting firm in Chicago. Her specialty was tracking hidden offshore assets and complex networks of shell companies. In less than a week, Chloe teamed up with Marcus. They launched a massive fine-tooth comb review of that mountain of trust statements. She cross-referenced every single administrative expense against financial market data and CPA signatures from that exact time. Line by line, she started piecing together a criminal puzzle that was 10 times worse than Marcus's initial rough estimate. Chloe often worked late into the night to avoid interfering with her day job. Once she sent me an updated spreadsheet at 11 o'clock at night and even apologized in the email. I never once felt like she was just doing me a favor out of pity. She did not have that condescending savior attitude at all. Actually, when enough hidden data points were lined up side by side, a really clear, incredibly ugly chain of money transfers popped right up. As a professional auditor, she actually seemed a little excited by the discovery. Maya also gave me something else I did not even realize I desperately needed. She gave me the exact words to define how I was feeling. "You are not having a paranoid episode," she told me during one of our late-night phone calls. I had just admitted that I still physically shook every time my phone rang. "You just found out that the so-called family who was supposed to protect your son's future has been quietly sucking his blood like parasites for decades," she said. "Of course you are on high alert. That is not weakness, Sarah. That is the natural human reaction when you realize your family is not at all who you thought they were." I started slowly expanding my support circle. I joined a single mom's support group that met every Tuesday night at the community center. It was mostly widows and divorced women. We sat in folding chairs and traded practical advice on how to deal with awful lawyers and how to survive lonely Sundays. The first time I went, I just wanted an excuse to not be alone in my empty house overthinking everything. But I stayed because of an older woman named Carol. Years ago, she had fought a brutal battle against her late husband's greedy family just to keep a small business afloat. She told me something I chewed on constantly after that. "They will use every trick in the book to make you feel like wanting fairness for your own kid is somehow crazy and greedy," she said. "Never let their anger and their loud voices successfully brainwash you into thinking you are the unreasonable one." Another woman in the group, Teresa, hardly ever spoke. But after my second meeting, she pulled me aside and just gave me one piece of advice. "Save every single email, even if it is just a meaningless greeting," she told me. "Save every voicemail. Arrogant elites like them always think they are smart enough to not leave a trail, but in reality their arrogance is usually their biggest blind spot." That was practical advice learned the hard way through blood, sweat, and tears by someone who had been burned badly. I carved it into my brain. By my fourth meeting, I actually found myself giving advice to a brand new member. She had just found out her late husband's brother was trying to steal her rightful share of a small farm by forging a signature. Almost without even noticing it, I was no longer that weak person just hiding in a corner, shaking and waiting for someone to rescue me. As far as I could tell, Eleanor and Arthur were doing exactly what Chloe and Marcus predicted. They were spying from the shadows, waiting patiently, and acting like vultures trying to scavenge any dirt they could use to drag my name through the mud in court later. I decided that while I was waiting, I was going to do something way more constructive. I was going to make myself bulletproof and get ready for the final showdown. The invitation to their carefully planned trap was delivered through Leo. I saw right through how nasty the setup was immediately. Eleanor purposely called the house landline instead of my cell phone because she knew Leo was the one most likely to pick it up. She used her most loving grandma voice to ask Leo if he and his mom could come over this Sunday for a long overdue family dinner. "Nothing serious," she coaxed the kid. "Just wanting the family to have a nice get-together before those cold legal papers ruin everything." Leo missed his grandma's roast beef so much, and at his age, he had absolutely no idea what court meant in this context. He begged me to go. I finally caved, mostly because Marcus thought it would be a huge strategic advantage to see exactly what kind of games they were trying to play before the final audit report was officially submitted to the court. "Listen more, talk less." That was what Marcus told me, half joking and half deadly serious. But when I actually sat back down at that familiar walnut dining table, I realized just how incredibly hard that advice was to follow. Eleanor's dining room was flawless, exactly like it always was. The expensive bone china was laid out perfectly. Right in the middle of the table was a sizzling, top-tier filet mignon roast. She even lit the handmade candles she usually saved for very important guests. For the first 20 minutes, it really did feel like slipping back into one of those normal Sundays from the past. Arthur kindly asked Leo how baseball was going, and Eleanor fussed over whether Leo wanted another scoop of mashed potatoes. Right before dinner, she even purposely pulled out an old, beat-up family photo album and left it open on the sideboard. The page it was open to had a picture of David when he was 16, wearing his high school baseball uniform and smiling brightly at the camera. Eleanor used this almost heartbroken tone to sigh and say, "I miss him like crazy every single day. You know, I just wish this ridiculous money drama had not happened after he left us. Later, when I made an excuse to go to the bathroom, I quickly flipped through that album. I sharply noticed that every single picture in there was heavily filtered. There was David as a kid, David as a teenager, David as the groom at our wedding. But I could not find a single picture of him before he was 9 years old. There was zero trace of those years before Richard Sterling supposedly died. It was exactly like the very first chapter of David's life, and the very existence of that man had been physically scrubbed entirely from that house. Even knowing that, I let my guard down just a tiny bit. Looking back on it now, that was exactly what they wanted me to do. Right when dessert was brought to the table, the masks completely came off. It was exactly like I described it to Maya later. Eleanor put down her sterling silver dessert fork. She looked at me with that exact same expression I had seen 1,000,000 times over the last decade. It was the wounded, incredibly patient look of a woman getting ready to hand down a guilty verdict while pretending it was just elderly wisdom. If David saw what this family has turned into now, he would be absolutely devastated, she sighed. All this ugly fighting over money, those greedy lawyers digging around like dogs. What is the point of it all? He would never want his son to grow up in an environment completely ripped apart by greed. He wanted Leo to grow up with the decency we all built together. If David saw what this family has turned into, he would be completely devastated, she sighed. All of this ugly fighting over money, those greedy lawyers digging around like dogs. What is the point of it all? He would never want his son to grow up in a place ripped apart by greed. He wanted Leo to grow up with the decency we all built together. This is not about greed, Eleanor, I argued back calmly. This is about a legal trust that belonged to your husband's son, and you have been secretly siphoning money out of it for the past 28 years. You have absolutely no idea how much I sacrificed to keep this family where it is today. Eleanor exploded, and her fake patience completely vanished. After Richard died, I was a single mother fighting tooth and nail in the business world. Arthur's father and I built Silverleaf from the ground up, and you just waltzed into this family 12 years ago. Now you are trying to paint me as some cheap thief just because I took the compensation I earned? That is exactly what I deserve for decades of pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into this family. Sitting across the table, Arthur saw things going south. He immediately took a much calmer, much more sinister approach. He glanced over at Leo, who was busy eating his cherry pie. Arthur purposely lowered his voice to make it sound like a secret agreement between conspirators instead of a direct interrogation. "Hey, buddy," Arthur said softly to Leo. "You would be pretty sad if you never got to see Grandma again, right?" Leo blinked in confusion. He still had a little pie filling on the corner of his mouth. He just answered automatically and said, "Yeah, of course." Arthur looked up and gave me a smug look. It was like he had just delivered the perfect closing argument for his own trial. I tried my hardest to push down the anger boiling inside me. I spoke to Leo as gently as I possibly could. "Honey, why don't you go watch the game in the TV room for a bit? The adults need to talk about some things." The second Leo left the dining room, I turned and glared right at Arthur. I showed absolutely no mercy. I told him exactly how despicable it was to use a 12-year-old kid as emotional blackmail in a game played by adults. He at least had a tiny shred of decency left. A brief flash of embarrassment crossed his face before he quickly put his poker face back on. "You should really think about Leo," Arthur said, dropping the act entirely. He leaned toward me with an aggressive stare. Just imagine the psychological trauma of a 12-year-old boy watching his own mother drag his grandmother into court like a common criminal. What will people in our circle say, Sarah? What will the powerful parents at his school think of him? Do you really want his family legacy to just be the label of the cold-blooded kid who sued his own relatives? That is a really fascinating argument, I sneered back. Especially coming from a corporate general counsel who signed his own name on a pile of completely fraudulent legal documents. I never planned to show my cards this early, but watching them shamelessly use Leo as a bargaining chip completely snapped the patience I had been holding onto for weeks. The muscles in Arthur's face twitched. His smooth, elite persona collapsed in half a second. It was replaced by a tense, hyper-aware panic, like he was suddenly under attack. He tried to act calm and asked me with a dry throat exactly what I meant by that. My mind flashed to the spreadsheets Chloe made with all those red highlights. I thought about Eleanor's signatures on documents claiming the trust never existed. I thought about David, forced to live in this mansion built on lies, pretending he never had a biological father who loved him. The judicial audit is completely finished. I spoke in a voice so quiet, it made the entire dining room fall dead silent. Chloe's team finished the final report last week. It clearly documents every single so-called management fee and consulting fee the two of you secretly skimmed from that trust account. That includes every dollar taken since I married David, and for many years before that. Marcus is officially submitting it to the court tomorrow morning. The silence that followed had actual physical weight to it. It was suffocating. The expression on Eleanor's face shifted several times in just a few seconds. It finally settled into an incredibly fragile, cold, and deadened gray. "You ungrateful, scheming viper," she said through gritted teeth. Her voice was low and shaking. "After everything this family did to give you a respectable life." Arthur suddenly stood up. His chair legs scraped against the floor with a piercing screech. He used a painfully stiff, fake cheerful voice to yell toward the TV room. He said it was probably time for Leo to get ready to head home. As he walked us to the front door, he never looked me in the eye again. On the drive home, Leo was sharp enough to pick up on the weird vibe. He asked me why everyone looked so mad at the end. I told him that adults sometimes have major disagreements over very important things. I made sure he knew it was absolutely not his fault, and he did not need to fix it. He accepted that explanation exactly like he accepted all my promises, with zero hesitation. Considering how much my stomach was still churning, his unconditional trust almost made me feel ashamed. But beneath that churning feeling, something much stronger had formed compared to a month ago. At that dinner table, they had used every weapon in their arsenal. They tried moral kidnapping, custody threats, David's memory, and even Leo's love for them. But none of it made me back down an inch. If I gained anything tonight, it was watching Eleanor's mask completely fall off. It burned away the very last shred of doubt left in my heart. I was finally done wondering if maybe I was overreacting, or if family loyalty really should matter more than the truth. No, it should not. Never again. Before the car even pulled into the garage, I dialed Marcus right from the driveway. While every detail was still crystal clear in my head, I repeated exactly what went down at dinner. After listening, Marcus had a tone of relieved approval. He told me that showing them our timeline and our cards early was a strategic shock tactic worth the risk. Now, if they ever tried to claim in court that the audit report was a surprise attack to get a delay, the judge would not buy it for a second. No matter what happened next, they completely lost the right to play the victim and say they were kept in the dark. The hearing was scheduled in a courtroom at the Cook County Probate Court. It was much smaller than I imagined. It had dull, dark wood paneling all around and pale fluorescent lights overhead. It had absolutely none of the dramatic tension you see in legal TV shows. Marcus had warned me beforehand that the whole process would feel incredibly boring and procedural for the most part, right up until the critical turning point. He was completely right. Eleanor and Arthur showed up with their highly paid defense attorney. He was a guy named Halloran. He looked sharp and completely humorless. In his opening statement, he shamelessly argued that the questioned money transfers were totally standard compensation for trustee services. He claimed it was all perfectly within Eleanor's discretionary power as a co-trustee. He also viciously framed the entire lawsuit as a deliberate attack. He called it the vengeful persecution by a grieving, mentally unstable daughter-in-law who was just lashing out at the family that had financially supported her for years. I sat there without moving a muscle. I just let the chain of evidence Chloe worked so hard to put together hit back for me. The first piece of core evidence Marcus submitted was simple and absolutely lethal. It was the original trust deed signed in 1989. The contract clearly stated that without the written permission of the trust protector, the trustee's annual compensation could never exceed 1% of the trust's total assets. And this crucial trust protector turned out to be Richard Sterling's younger brother. That meant it was David's biological uncle, Walter Sterling, a man he had never even met. This 78-year-old man was still alive and well, living a quiet life in a small town up in Maine. Marcus's investigation team had miraculously tracked him down 2 weeks ago. Walter testified via video link for the court. He spoke with a heavy Northeast accent. He stated flat out that in the last 30 years, nobody had ever asked for his opinion on a single trust expense. Aside from getting a brief notice when it was first set up decades ago, he had no idea the trust was even still operating. There was absolutely no way he could have signed off on those approval documents for so-called compensation, totaling over $1.2 million. Halloran tried to do some damage control during his cross-examination. He aggressively questioned Walter, asking if maybe his old age made him simply forget signing those approval papers over the past 30 years. Walter did not get rattled at all. He just let out a cold laugh and said he had not forgotten a thing, because nothing ever happened for him to forget. He told the lawyer that if he had ever signed away over $1 million with the stroke of a pen, he would definitely remember it. He said he never signs documents he does not remember. Right after that, Marcus dropped a second massive bombshell that caught the opposing counsel completely off guard. It was a commercial registration record. The record showed that a limited liability company registered in Delaware called Summit Medical Consulting had received massive so-called consulting fees from the Sterling Trust accounts. This happened 7 different times over the past 8 years, and Chloe's deep dive proved that the sole person controlling this shell company was Arthur. Not only was this money never used for any actual trust management, but there was not a single mention of these funds anywhere in the official financial reports of Eleanor's prized Silver Leaf Company. Before Halloran could even finish getting his objection out, Judge Alvarez cut him off and ruthlessly shot it down. The judge, notorious for her iron fist style in the courtroom, turned her head and looked directly at Arthur. Her expression made it clear she was looking at a piece of absolute garbage. "Mr. Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "would you care to explain to this court exactly what indispensable consulting services your shell company provided to this trust, which belonged to your late brother, that justified you cutting yourself such massive checks every single quarter?" Arthur opened his mouth, but after spending the entire morning speaking with absolute fluency, he couldn't even piece together a coherent sentence. Yet the ultimate noose tightening around his neck wasn't just where the money had gone, it was the forged signatures. Marcus presented the court with the so-called independent audit compliance letter that Arthur had submitted to a Seattle registry, a move specifically designed to bypass his Uncle Walter's scrutiny. Chloe's investigation had revealed that the 2018 letter, which carried the letterhead of Harrison and Associates CPA in Boston, was a complete fake. As it turned out, that Boston firm had been bought out and officially rebranded back in 2016. "Judge Alvarez," Marcus said, his voice echoing through the dead-silent courtroom with the chilling calmness of an executioner. "The defendant, Mr. Arthur, used the letterhead of an accounting firm that had legally ceased to exist under that name 2 years prior to forge an independent audit certification. He did this specifically to hide the fact that he and Ms. Eleanor were actively stealing the principal from this trust. This was hard, technical, undeniable proof. It didn't just shatter their defense, it smashed the final rock hiding this nest of vipers." Halloran leaned over, frantically whispering something to Arthur. I watched Arthur's face turn a sickening shade of pale. It was that exact same unnameable terror I had seen on Benjamin's face when he first saw that $68 million balance in the tax system. Judge Alvarez, who had barely said a word during the first hour of the hearing, finally took off her reading glasses. "I need to summarize exactly what I am looking at in this courtroom today," she said, staring directly at the defense table. Her voice was ice cold. "We have a trust established for a minor child that has been maliciously raided by its co-trustee for nearly 30 years. This trustee not only unlawfully authorized exorbitant payouts to himself, but he also conspired with an unauthorized third party, his own younger son. Together, without the legal consent of the trust protector, they used sham corporations and fraudulent documents from a defunct business to aggressively siphon off assets." She then shifted her gaze to Halloran. "Mr. Halloran, I strongly advise your clients to retain top-tier federal criminal defense counsel immediately, and I highly recommend they do not share the same lawyer for this. The moment we adjourn today, I am referring this entire file directly to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. This has moved far beyond the jurisdiction of probate court." Back in the gallery, Eleanor completely dropped her high and mighty upper-class act. She stared blankly at the documents on the table, her hands clenched so tightly together that her knuckles turned a deathly white. She looked like a woman watching her magnificent castle of lies, which she had meticulously built over 30 years, instantly turn to dust under the heavy hammer of reality. At one point, she snapped her head around and looked at Arthur with an expression of pure shock and despair. It became glaringly obvious that while Eleanor had participated in taking the money under the guise of family compensation, she likely had absolutely no idea that Arthur had set up a Delaware shell company behind her back to pocket the lion's share of the cash and forge federal audit documents. Their alliance of greed fractured in a single second under the weight of impending federal charges. Sitting at the plaintiff's table, I didn't feel that grand sense of cinematic revenge people always talk about. What I felt was a pure, profound stillness. It was the quiet calm of a woman who had spent 4 months grit-faced and tense, bracing for a fatal blow, only to watch that devastating hit land squarely on her opponents instead. Eleanor turned her head and looked at me across the courtroom. For the first time in the 14 years I had known her, there was no calculation in her eyes, no patronizing contempt. There was only fear, raw and unadulterated fear. It was the true face of a person who had completely run out of cards to play. The official court order came down 9 days later. Marcus didn't even wait for me to get off work. He called and read the verdict straight to me. His voice carried that deep satisfaction unique to a top litigator who had just flawlessly crushed his target. Judge Alvarez officially confirmed Leo as the sole rightful beneficiary of the Sterling Family Trust and appointed me as the sole trustee, giving me full control over the assets, which were now verified at $68.4 million. The court permanently stripped Eleanor Miller of her status as co-trustee, issuing a formal judicial finding of a severe breach of fiduciary duty. The judge held both Eleanor and Arthur jointly and severally liable for the $1.2 million they had misappropriated, plus years of interest, and she kept her promise by sending the entire case file to the federal prosecutor's office to open a criminal fraud investigation. Once the first domino fell, the chain reaction happened much faster than I ever anticipated. The board of directors at Silverleaf Senior Living, which included 3 old guard, non-family directors who had built the company alongside Arthur's biological father, had zero tolerance for a court-stamped fraud scandal. These were old business foxes responsible for the livelihoods of thousands of employees. Less than 3 weeks after the ruling, the board called an emergency meeting. Citing a breach of fiduciary duties and the urgent need to protect the company's critical Medicare contracts, they ruthlessly voted to oust Eleanor as chairwoman and terminated Arthur from his position as general counsel at the exact same time. A major financial newspaper in Chicago ran a brief piece on it in a small corner of the business section. The headline made my stomach turn, even though every single word was the absolute truth. Local healthcare real estate, matriarch forced out, amid family trust fraud allegations. Eleanor, a woman who had spent the last 30 years being fawned over at every high society charity luncheon and Chamber of Commerce dinner in Cook County, became the main subject of the exact kind of high society gossip she used to threaten to destroy me with. Later, a former neighbor told me that Eleanor stopped showing up for Thursday afternoon tea at the North Shore Country Club, an exclusive spot where only the mega-rich could get in. Apparently, 2 longtime members had intentionally and viciously discussed the newspaper article right next to her, loudly wondering if the scandal about her stealing from her own grandson's trust fund was actually true. The criminal investigation took much longer, as cases involving tax fraud and interstate wire fraud usually do. But by late autumn, the U.S. Attorney's Office officially filed charges against both Eleanor and Arthur. Eleanor was charged with breach of fiduciary duty, while Arthur faced the same charge alongside severe federal felonies, including wire fraud and money laundering using forged instruments. Faced with bulletproof evidence, their defense lawyers had no choice but to take humiliating plea deals. Eleanor narrowly avoided prison time by returning the stolen funds in full, paying massive fines, accepting 5 years of probation, and taking a lifetime ban from ever serving as a trustee or board member for any business entity. Arthur, because of his central role in forging the audit documents, used aggressive plea bargaining to get a shorter prison sentence, but he walked away with a federal felony record that can never be expunged. I learned later that this led the Illinois State Bar Association to permanently disbar him. The cost of losing their reputation was far more devastating than the million-dollar fines. Several municipal healthcare providers who had partnered with Silverleaf for years quietly refused to renew their annual contracts after reading the court's finding of major fraud in the local papers. Marcus once told me that a reputation built over 30 years, once branded with fraud, can never survive intact, no matter how the legal proceedings are settled. Because their cash flow dried up, the court-ordered restitution had to be broken down into a 4-year payment plan, complete with brutal, mandatory quarterly financial reporting. Marcus said it was essentially like forcing them to go through a mini-public trial every 3 months. According to a distant relative who occasionally passes along updates, Eleanor found the humiliation of having her finances stripped bare and audited on a regular basis far more agonizing than the original verdict itself. Once the whole mess became public knowledge, a few of David's relatives on his father's side, people I hadn't spoken to in years, reached out to me privately. A great-aunt living in Oregon and a cousin who used to hang out with David all the time before his parents divorced both confessed something to me. They admitted that for all these years, they always thought Eleanor's story about the details surrounding Richard Sterling's death was incredibly vague and full of holes. But as outsiders, neither of them had ever wanted to be the one to break the illusion. Hearing all of this brought a strange sense of comfort to my chest. It meant that for all those years, I wasn't just imagining things or losing my mind when I doubted their contradictory lies. As it turned out, other people had seen the rot hidden beneath the surface, too. Everyone had just chosen to maintain a perfectly coordinated silence. I want to say that I didn't feel a single shred of satisfaction in any of this. I want to act like some noble saint and say I had grown past that petty urge to prove I was right. But that would be a lie. After being soaked in this family's disgusting lies for over a decade, I was completely done with taking the high road. What I felt was a deeply human, unglamorous, but incredibly real sense of relief. It was the sheer lightness of watching a long meat grinder of a battle finally come to an end. It was the freedom of no longer having to nervously guard against the next probing phone call or fear a suspicious car parked outside my house. There was no polite reconciliation here, no hypocritical compromise to save everyone's face so we could keep fake smiling at Sunday dinners. Eleanor had confidently bet on every single move, fully believing that her financial gifts and moral blackmail would eventually crush my determination to find the truth. But in this gamble, she lost everything. And the fatal blow that ruined her came from a cold video link testimony provided by her own brother-in-law who was living in seclusion up in Maine. When Leo heard the news, his reaction was exactly like any 12-year-old boy facing something too massive to fully digest. He asked a few incredibly blunt questions, and after listening to my explanation, he calmly turned right back to what he was doing. So, Grandma and Uncle Arthur teamed up to steal the money that was supposed to be left for me, and they forged documents to do it? He was sitting on the carpet, still holding his PS5 controller. When I used the gentlest but most direct words possible to tell him that, yes, that was pretty much exactly what happened, he went quiet for a few seconds. Then he just said, "Grown-ups are so trash." With that, he hit the resume button and jumped right back into his game of God of War. That was the first time in months I laughed completely out loud. I was amazed at how a 12-year-old could summarize a complex case filled with betrayal and greed so perfectly and hit the nail right on the head. I never saw Eleanor again after that disgusting plea hearing. A few months later, she sent a long letter. I only skimmed it quickly and never replied. This wasn't out of some winner's cruelty, but because I finally understood one fact with absolute clarity. There was truly nothing left for us to talk about. The trust belonged entirely to Leo, and the truth was out in the open. The real war was over. She had lost every single part of it without gaining a single concession. A year later, our life looked almost ordinary again. After going through all that chaos, ordinary itself felt like the biggest possible victory. I had quit my exhausting and low-paying freelance gig as a medical illustrator. It wasn't because we were suddenly wealthy enough to throw money around, but because I finally had the capital to pursue something that truly mattered to me. I used a portion of the interest generated by the trust to buy a small commercial space in downtown Chicago and started a nonprofit called the David Miller Neurodiversity Arts Foundation. We provide free professional mentoring and exhibition space for kids who have dyslexia or other neurodevelopmental differences, but are incredibly gifted in art, just like Leo. In a way, it felt like making up for the lifetime of stolen potential of a man who had been stripped of his father's love. We still live in the same neighborhood with the creaky wooden stairs. The leaning wooden deck in the backyard was finally fixed. Leo didn't want to leave this place because his father's memory is still so alive here. From the oak tree they planted together in the yard to the basketball hoop David installed by the driveway with his own hands. Leo, who is almost 13 now, has grown into a much more grounded kid than I ever expected for someone on the edge of his teenage years after such a turbulent year. His questions have slowed down, replaced by a deep sense of security now that our life is finally settled. He even started asking about his biological grandfather in Seattle, Richard Sterling. I handed him the photo I found in the basement blueprints tube, the one of the two men modifying an engine in the garage, and told him the whole truth I had pieced together about that man. Now, Leo keeps that photo in a nice frame, sitting right on his nightstand next to his bed. Chloe and Maya have become permanent fixtures in our lives. Chloe used her incredible professional skills to help me set up the foundation's financial records so perfectly that they are completely bulletproof. Maya is still my Tuesday night coffee buddy, the woman who believed in me unconditionally just because I was her friend, long before any real evidence ever came to light. I also dipped my toes into dating again. He is a guy I met in a single-parent support group. The relationship brings a wonderful, quiet peace, because he knows absolutely nothing about the fake myth of how glamorous the Miller family used to be. He just sees me for who I am today. By contrast, Eleanor and Arthur's lives have become like a piece of cheap fabric that, once torn open, just keeps rotting away. This is the inevitable end for people who rely on carefully manufactured vanity to maintain a reputation when reality finally bites back. Under its new leadership, Silver Leaf rebranded completely within a year, decisively scrubbing the corporate image clean of the fraudulent Miller name. Because of the scandal, several lucrative state healthcare contracts they heavily relied on didn't survive the transition. The massive business machine that once employed thousands of people across the state has been broken up and forced to sell off most of its assets. Stripped of her board seat, her executive perks, and practically all her high society social status, Eleanor was forced to sell the Gold Coast mansion she had proudly lived in for 30 years just to pay off her massive criminal settlements, civil damages, and sky-high attorney fees. According to a distant cousin who still shares updates with me, Eleanor now lives completely alone in a generic apartment on the edge of the city, rarely ever showing her face. Arthur's marriage didn't even survive the federal felony conviction and the financial collapse that followed. Just 8 months after the plea deal was signed, his wife filed for divorce. The paperwork cited standard irreconcilable differences, but everyone who knew the situation understood what that phrase actually translated to. It meant, I didn't sign a prenup to stay with a bankrupt felon whose reputation is entirely destroyed. Having lost his highly valuable law license, Arthur now works a humbling job doing warehouse bookkeeping for a car parts dealership out in the suburbs. Going from a general counsel and co-founder who managed tens of millions of dollars and drove a Porsche to country clubs, down to a guy checking inventory sheets surrounded by the smell of motor oil every day, is a long and painful professional freefall. My cousin also told me that Arthur almost never mentions Silverleaf or any of his past glory anymore. It is as if he believes that if he just stays quiet, the world will eventually forget what he did. I don't go out of my way to look for updates on either of them. But news has a way of finding you, just like news about people you once loved or deeply feared always finds a way to reach your ears. Every time I hear about them, the ripple it causes in my heart is much smaller than I ever expected. It isn't a burst of malicious joy, but a quiet confirmation. The way the world works is often much fairer than you imagine when you are waiting in despair through the long, dark night. Leo and I are thriving, growing beautiful new flowers over the ruins of the past. They are not. I didn't map out their current misery to get revenge. All I did was dig up the truth that had been buried away in a basement and let the consequences land exactly on the shoulders of the people who deserved to carry them. As it turned out, the truth alone was more than enough.